Hello, Old Testament class. Welcome back. This week we'll be talking about the book of Deuteronomy. We're continuing the conversation that we started with Professor Yoder's presentation on the frame of Deuteronomy, that is Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 11, and then the end of Deuteronomy all the way through chapter 34. So to this section of our class, we will talk about Deuteronomy chapters 12 through 26, which we would call the kind of center of the law code of Deuteronomy, or the Deuteronomic Code. So I know we've talked a little bit about laws, about suzerainty treaties, and things like this when we talked about Exodus. I'm going to go back over a little bit of that material today, in a sense, to try to weave it together in a way that makes sense for the book of Deuteronomy, which is really an updating, in a way, of the laws we see in Exodus. We'll cover this in a couple of videos this section, and the next module that we'll go to will be on the book of Joshua, and we'll talk about holy war. So we will move away from the Pentateuch and actually go into what's called the former prophets in the Jewish canon. So Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, known as former prophets. Or in the Christian tradition, these are often called the history books, Joshua and Judges. Now notice we won't talk about Ruth until second semester. That's because in the Jewish tradition, Ruth is grouped with a different set of books than it is in the Christian tradition, where it comes after the book of Judges and before the book of Samuel. So in the Jewish tradition, it's grouped with the Megillot, these 5 scrolls that are read on major holidays. Ruth being read on Shavuot or Pentecost. So, okay, but we're going to stick with Deuteronomy for now, which talks about Shavuot and Pentecost and all sorts of things. But our focus on this section will be on the question, what does law do in ancient Israel? And how does the covenant work? So, with that, we'll move on. I'm going to read you a bit of something and just try to imagine what world this comes from. What does it conjure up in your mind? Here it goes. Of the beasts in the field and of the fishes in the sea, of all the foods that are acceptable in my sight you may eat, but not in the living room. Of the juices and other beverages, yes, even those in sippy cups you may drink, but not in the living room, neither may you carry such therein. Indeed, when you reach the place where the living room carpet begins, of any food or beverage there you may not eat, neither may you drink. Drink your milk as it is given to you. Neither use on it any utensils, nor fork, nor knife, nor spoon, for that is not what they are for. If you will dip your blocks into the milk, and then you lick it off, you will be sent away. Sit just as I have told you. Do not lean to one side or another, or slide down until you have nearly slid away. Heed me, for if you sit like that, your hair will go down into the syrup. And now behold, even as I have said, it has come to pass. Bite not, lest you be cast into quiet time. Neither drink of your own bath water, nor the bath water of any kind, nor rub your feet on bread, even if it is in the package. Leave the cat alone, for what has the cat done that you should so afflict it with duct tape? So those are from an article in the Atlantic Monthly from February 1997. The article is called Household Principles for Children from the Old Testament, Lamentations of the Father by Ian Fraser. You can just Google that and find the whole article. There's a lot more to it. I think it's pretty funny. That is, it's trying to recast the biblical law codes in this different world, right? So if you just think about it for a second, what was the world that those those particular laws in Ian Fraser's article, where do they come from? Well, they talk about sippy cups and timeout and the living room and having carpet in the living room and having a cat. These come from the world of a family. These come from the world of presumably an American family, a middle-class or upper-class American family. These presume a family network of kind of the nuclear family, a parent and a child of some sort, and a household pet, a cat. And they're all about rules, right? These rules that parents have. So it's making fun a bit about how parents make up these rules that are a bit like the rules that God makes up for Israel in order to help Israel grow and develop and become ethical and mature in some way. There's a bunch of stuff that's presumed in these laws, though, not necessarily Israel. Well, yes, Israel's, but these laws about the household family or whatever that I was reading to you. There's a presumed hierarchy of relationships there. There's a parent and there's a child. There are obligations of parents and children for one another. There's a pedagogical element to this. The parents want to teach the kids how to be, right? Don't break things. Don't make messes. Don't, hurt the cat, right? And these rules make sense in a way, at least. Maybe we wouldn't follow all of them ourselves, but they presume kind of a narrative that many of us are familiar with, right? There's relationships in the family that need to be mediated in some way, and there need to be some boundaries for children, especially. There should be boundaries for parents as well. But these laws belong to this kind of world and presume that world, but they don't always tell you all of that. That is, if you read these household principles for children from the Old Testament, a bunch of those rules that I just read you, if you read that and you aren't familiar with anything about American life and American culture, or I guess some of these things would map onto, say, European life and European culture in South America, etc. But if you come from the ancient world and you read those things, you'd say, I don't know what a sippy cup is. I don't know why children would be playing with blocks. People have cats as pets. You might be confused by some of these things. There's this whole world that is presumed by the law codes. And that is true of any ancient law code you read, too. That is, modern law codes and ancient law codes, they don't spell out everything about the context into which they're speaking their laws. They are presuming that you already, if the laws are for you, you already know something about the world in which the laws are written, and they don't need to tell you the whole story. By the way, here's a little image that I have in my mind of a child drinking milk. This is a bit more like what my mealtime with my family used to be like, especially for my son Freddie, who's exuberant in all things and eating as well. As we like to say, your face is not a napkin. But in any event, in Georgia, so I'm sitting here in my house in Decatur, Georgia, in the state of Georgia in the United States, and if I wanted to go find the law code for the state of Georgia, I would have to go look for the official code of Georgia annotated. Now, the annotated version, because it kind of has more information about the laws, but the official code of Georgia is the law code for the state of Georgia. So you can go find all of the laws that are currently in existence for the state of Georgia. They update it every year and so on, I think at least. But you can see here title, game and fish, health and highways, insurance, and so on. So there's just all these different titles, and they deal with these different situations. Now, if you read the official code of Georgia annotated, it doesn't start with a history of the universe. It doesn't start with the history or the story of the founding of the United States of America. It doesn't go into detail about the founding of the state of Georgia. It doesn't tell stories about the families that are a part of this place. It doesn't talk about the indigenous peoples who existed here before the state of Georgia existed as an entity. There's all of that is presumed. It's all already wrapped up in the world in which the law codes are spoken. So all this stuff that exists, that Georgia is a part of the United States of America, so there's the U.S. Constitution is in some way implied by the state code of Georgia, the official code of Georgia annotated. All these stories that are wrapped up in all of these different things are presumed as a part of it. Even some things that probably aren't stated in the official code of Georgia annotated, like we don't have aristocracy in the United States, or at least officially, right? There aren't different classes of people according to the law. I know that in effect this exists, but the principle, at least, is that there aren't different codes, different classes of people like you would find in, say, ancient law codes, where there are aristocrats who get a certain law code for them, and then there are peasants that get a completely different law code for them. Like I said, in practice, this might be different, but the official code of Georgia annotated presumes this idea that everyone should be equal under the law. Now, I know that that's not the case in practice, but you wouldn't know that necessarily. If you read the official code of Georgia annotated, it doesn't say anywhere all people should be equal under the law, but that is kind of a presumption that comes into these legal disputes. So all to say that there's a larger cultural, historical, narrative framework that's presupposed by all these different law codes that we find in the modern world and in the ancient world. So what's the context for the law of Deuteronomy for these chapters 12 through 26? If you read them straight through, you might say, boy, there's a lot of stuff in here that is just bizarre. And it's true, it is. But if we think of the context for these ancient laws that we find in Deuteronomy as being part of the ancient world, as Chris Hayes tells us about in Hidden Riches, it does make it easier for us to understand what these laws are trying to do. That world that's presumed that the law code speaks into, all these presumptions that are made about what a king is and what aristocrats are, what peasants are. The fact that slavery exists is kind of presumed by these law codes. There's a lot of presumptions made about gender, about ethnic differences. There's a lot of presumptions about age. There's a lot of presumptions about land and what it means, how land works or inheritance works. A lot of these things are just presumed. They already think that you know. If you don't know those things, then how could we find out? Well, we can find out by reading lots of ancient literature as much as we can find, and comparing it, and also digging up things archaeologically and seeing how things actually seem to have been laid out in practice. So there's lots of information that we can learn about the ancient world that can help us to rebuild this lost world of this ancient context. One of the things that we can see when we look at ancient Eastern law, and by the way, I mean, just thinking about law in general, every ancient culture and modern culture needs some kind of law, right? You can't live without organization. I mean, there's organizational principles in everything in the universe. Even the cosmos itself, right? The E equals MC squared. This is a law. The speed of light, right? 186,000 miles per second is how fast light can go. It's the universal speed limit. There are rules that hold together the cosmos itself. There are rules that we can see in nature, that is principles or laws in a way. So that we all need these kind of organizational principles, or else there's chaos, and not in the good sense. And you know, there's an argument about where exactly the line between order and chaos should be in many different instances as well. But all to say, everyone's got rules for how to organize different groups. We can make decisions and make judgments about whether certain organizational principles are good or not. Do they lead to certain outcomes that we want? But we have to have discussions about those things. So we can make some of these, we can study the ancient literature, and we can make some of these claims about here's the principles that these ancient law codes seem to presume, right? We can kind of try to figure out, what did they want? What was justice to them is maybe a way that we can think about this. There were lots of ancient Near Eastern law codes, even before Hammurabi, as Chris Hayes talks about in his chapter Law Collections, starting at page 121 in Hidden Riches. Lots of ancient law codes before Hammurabi, the laws of Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar and laws of Ashuna. There were law codes that afterwards. And one of the things we can see is that these law codes function really differently than our modern law codes function. So remember the official code of Georgia annotated, there was like volumes, and each volume had like a different, one's about fishing, laws about fishing, okay? And they were all grouped together, and they probably start with like big general laws, and then they get to more specific laws. In the ancient world, they didn't organize things this way. They organized these lists of laws in, I think, a very different way, in fact. So if you start with the Law of Hammurabi on page 121, you'll start with this prologue where there is kind of this story about the world, right? When the god Anu, the king of the Anunnaki deities, and the Lord god Enlil, Lord of heaven and earth, who determines the destinies of the land, allotted supreme power over all peoples to the god Marduk. So Marduk is the god of Babylon. Marduk received this ultimate power from higher gods, and Marduk became kind of the high god. And then Marduk's town or city, Babylon, became the biggest city. So this is one of the ways they explain how is it that one city is dominant, and then that city declines, and then another city becomes more dominant in Mesopotamia. It's because the idea is that the gods are kind of passing around who gets to be in charge for a while. So while Babylon is in charge, then Marduk is in charge. The god of Babylon. And Hammurabi is the king of Babylon at the time that it rose to prominence, right around about 1800 BCE. So this is 600 years before Israel is a people. is when Hammurabi comes to power and Babylon rises as a great power. So if you look at, there's this kind of introduction where Hammurabi says, I'm doing a good job. I'm keeping laws. I'm trying to make sure that the gods get what's theirs, and I'm trying to make sure that the order is kept in my province. And at the very end, if you look on page 123, just above that section that says laws, Hammurabi says, when the god Marduk commanded me to provide just ways for the people of the land in order to attain appropriate behavior, I established truth and justice as the declaration of the land. I enhanced the well-being of the people. So the idea is that the gods gave Hammurabi the responsibility to establish truth and justice, and then he made the laws. This right here is the stela, or giant sculpture of Hammurabi's code. There isn't just one copy of Hammurabi's code. There were many, many copies of it. Some of them were display copies like this one. Some of them were just written down as really like scribal exercises. It's like a thing that kids would, while they were learning to be scribes in the ancient world, they would copy Hammurabi's code to learn how to write. So all to say that we have lots of copies of Hammurabi's code throughout the ancient world. That's why it's also often called the first law code. It's the first law code around the world that people copied for many centuries afterward, even though there were law codes for hundreds of years before that in Mesopotamia. But you can see here, this is a kind of display copy, if you will. This is a public a monument that has been made out of Hammurabi's code. And in fact, part of Hammurabi's code tells people you can go check out the public display of Hammurabi's code and make sure that you're getting paid on time, or that you're getting paid enough. So the fact is that this is supposed to be displayed in some places. On top there, you see that this is actually in the Louvre today, the French in Paris, the French Museum of Ancient History. That's like a part of the larger Louvre complex. And at the very top there, I'm going to focus in on that. You can see there's a sculpture, right? This is an image that's supposed to explain in visual terms what this law is. And so standing up with his hand like this, that's Hammurabi. He's wearing what looks like a knit cap. That is a shepherd's hat, because in ancient Mesopotamia, kings were presented as shepherds. He's got his hand in a kind of a gesture of reverence. He is standing because the seated person is the one who's more has a higher stature, a higher status. So Hammurabi is coming into the presence of a king of gods. So Hammurabi is receiving something, and then from this seated god, you can tell it's a god because the seated figure has what looks like soft serve ice cream on his head. Those are really horns. In ancient art, if someone depicted a god in ancient Mesopotamia, but also in ancient Canaan, they would put images of horns coming up off of the head of the human-like creature, and that would tell you it was a god. So that the more horns, the more powerful a god it was. So this is a super high god with 4 big horns wrapping around the divine head. And then you can see it looks like a little bit like Pigpen from Snoopy. It's got like kind of like stinky armpit, lines coming off of it, but off of each armpit of this seated figure. Really, that's an ancient way of drawing light. So this is light that's emanating from the body of this god, which tells us it's Shamash, the sun god. So this is the sun god of ancient Mesopotamia, who is handing over these 2 things. One's a stick, and then there's like a cord, and these were used to measure. These were instruments of measuring. The whole point is to say that Hammurabi, the king, has been given the authority to make the laws. So the gods of the ancient world didn't give laws to kings or to people. The ancient gods gave the authority to make and the responsibility to make the laws to the king. And so what Hammurabi is doing by promulgating and promoting and publicly publishing this law code and disseminating it, he's trying to show the gods, I did my job. I'm keeping order in my land. Now, why would the gods want Hammurabi to keep order? Why would they care? Well, because remember, the gods live in a temple and they need food. So if there's a well-governed and well-ordered city like Babylon, then Marduk's going to be pretty happy. There's going to be a lot of grain coming into the temple. If Babylon is able to control all the adjacent, all the nearby cities and coordinate with them so that there is a shared prosperity, then all of the gods will be really happy. That's the basic idea. So then you move into the actual law code. So if you're looking in Hidden Riches on page 123, there's this prologue that explains, who am I? I'm Hammurabi. Where did I get this authority? I got it from the gods. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to establish truth and justice and order, really, to be able to keep keep the system going, keep the gods happy. And then here's the laws. Now, this is a really, really important piece of information here. These law codes, they are not systematic. That means that they don't go from biggest laws, most important laws, to least important laws. They don't go by general principle laws. And on the beginning of the Official Code of Georgia Annotated defines what a citizen is. So in other words, who do these laws apply to? Who do these laws apply to? That's the point of the beginning. That's where it starts, right? So kind of a good place to start, right? Who are these laws for? That's not addressed in this law code. Just look where it starts. The first law of this law code, Law of Hammurabi. If a man accuses another man and charges him with homicide, but cannot bring proof against him, his accuser shall be killed. Okay, so we're starting off pretty intense, right? But also just what is this law? The first law is about somebody accusing someone else with no proof. So if a person accuses another person with no proof, then they get killed. It's pretty intense, first of all. The second thing is, that's where you start your law code? Like, that's an interesting place to start, a false accusation. But then number two, if a man charges another man with practicing witchcraft and can't bring proof against him, he who is charged with witchcraft shall go to the divine river ordeal. That is, you get thrown into the river to see if you're right or not. This is wait, so second is like if you're accused of witchcraft in the divine river ordeal. I thought we were talking about murder here, right? If a person accuses another person of murder, or were we talking about false testimony? What is the connection between 1 and 2? And then 3, if a man comes forward to give false testimony in a case but cannot give evidence for his accusation, if that involves a capital offense, the man shall be killed. That was law number 1. It's like the same thing. And then if you come forward to give false testimony for grain or silver, you should get a penalty for that case. So it's like kind of like a lesser thing let me just say, these laws are not ordered in a way that make a whole lot of sense to people who are used to the modern ways of ordering and categorizing and cataloging laws. But what's important, too, is that when we look at the Law of Hammurabi, we can see it was copied a lot and copied over a wide geographic area. But we also have a wide distribution and a long period of time of copies of rulings that judges made. And one thing about the law, at least in the United States, is that when a judge follows a law, the judge cites the law when the judge writes up the case, right? When the judge issues the judge's ruling, the judge is going to write out precisely what law is being referred to that allows the judge to make this ruling. And the judge will often have precedents, other cases that have come forward where the judge is referring to those things. We find none of that in ancient law, in ancient writings by judges that actually give their judgments. They don't cite precedent, really, and they also don't cite particular laws. We never have a case where some judge says, hey, according to the Law of Hammurabi, here's what I'm supposed to do. Instead, the judges give what they think are wise rulings. This lets us know something, is that the Law of Hammurabi was not used like we use modern law codes. It was not precedent, and it was not used case law is used today. But it wasn't also used the way that we apply laws to particular situations. They did not think that way. So what did they make these things for? Well, Coogan tells you it was for propaganda. Like the king was just trying to puff himself up. I don't think this is actually I think that's too cynical a reading. I think why would Hammurabi go to all this effort to write these law codes out and have these public monuments made and so on, et cetera, et cetera? I think the reason that you have these law codes, there might be a couple different reasons. I don't know exactly. My guess, though, is that these are supposed to be this is a way of giving you principles. So when we read ancient literature, ancient like wisdom literature, like the book of Proverbs, we don't read systematic philosophical categorization. We just don't find the kinds of what we think of, and when I say we, I mean like especially Western people who've been trained in sort of European or Anglo institutions of learning, where we start with first principles and then we break things down into smaller pieces and so on. In the ancient world, they worked with lists. They would make long lists of all possible ramifications of something. And it seems that the people who made these lists, these very wise ancient people, would find principles in and among these different lists. But they wouldn't write the principles down. They would just feel them or intuit them or figure them out. And that's how these judges and other people were taught about what wise judgment was, by reading these lists and getting a sense for how lots of people in different times and places, because Hammurabi collected these laws. These are examples of good, wise laws, according to Hammurabi. Now, I don't think some of them are wise at all, but this is how Hammurabi's job is to collect these examples of good laws and put them out there so that people had an idea. People were formed or shaped by these principles that were kind of presumed in these laws. It's a bit like the book of Proverbs, which gives you even sometimes conflicting proverbs, one right after the other. But the point is that you're supposed to become formed and shaped by reading the book of Proverbs so that you can figure out which proverbs to use in which situations. So they don't tell you exactly how to act. They're trying to get you to become the kind of person who can figure out how to act in different situations. So in that sense, I think that if we approach Deuteronomy and Exodus and Leviticus and so on, less as giving you every single possible instance, kind of like we think of modern laws today, and giving you punishments that have to be applied and the judge doesn't have a choice or something like this. Instead, thinking that these are trying to give you examples from which you are supposed to deduce some deeper principles, and then maybe even come to conclusions or propose things, or in your if you're a judge, in your judgments, you might even do things differently than are proposed in the law of Hammurabi, but you've been formed by it because you're trying to figure out that deeper principle. So that's what I think is going on in these ancient law codes. But one of the things we can say from the laws of Hammurabi, there's a bunch of things we can say. But a couple things is, number one, the king makes the law. The gods give the law, the legal responsibility to the king, and the king makes the law. That's number one. Number two, we can say that these laws are not ethical or religious. The gods are mentioned in the epilogue and the prologue, like the beginning and the end of the law code. There's a little story about Hammurabi, but the gods aren't telling you what to do here. It's just, if a person does this, then you're supposed to do that. If a person does this, then you're supposed to do that. It's not because the gods want it. What the gods want is the king to do this, right? The gods are outsourcing the responsibility to the king. So the king, this is all the king's mouth. This is what the king is saying, right? It's not about the gods, and it's not ethical. That is to say, there aren't ethical principles that we can see here. It's about keeping order. So in other words, we don't hear no one says, "Hey, human life is important." We don't hear that in the laws of Hammurabi or the laws of Lipit Ishtar. That doesn't seem to be the kind of guiding principle that we can see. The guiding principles are, how do we keep order? How do we keep our structure going? And in that regard, we can see some of these different we can see other parts of ancient culture that were responsible for religious and ethical teaching and shaping and growth. So the household would be one place where you would learn how to be a good person. So the laws of Hammurabi don't say, there's no place in the laws of Hammurabi that say, be nice to your mom. Being nice to your mom was an important part of the ancient world. But the king doesn't tell you that. And in fact, like the laws of Georgia, the state of Georgia today, they don't tell you to be nice to your mom. That's something that you learn in the home, right, with the family, or you learn it, sort of you're in your community in some way. So another thing is that the religious laws, those were that was the temple's job, right? The priests were in charge of what the gods wanted, and the gods weren't that interested in ethics either in the ancient world. Shamash doesn't really care about you being nice. Shamash wants food. Shamash wants order in the temple, and Shamash wants your family to take care of the stuff about you being nice to people. And Shamash wants the king to take care of making sure that there's law and order in society so that there's food, and Shamash wants the priest to take care of making sure that that food is collected in a good way, and that the kind of spiritual affairs of the kingdom are handled responsibly. So you can see this kind of throughout this law code. It doesn't tell the priest to do stuff. This is for kind of people. One other thing we can say is that these laws, so the king makes them, right? The God tells the king to make them, and the king makes them. Number two, they're not ethical or religious. They're civil or criminal laws, right? These are laws about keeping order in society, the laws of Hammurabi. And another thing we can say is that they're hierarchical. The point of these laws is to keep order. There's this rhetoric in the prologue in the epilogue that it's about justice, and there's even kind of mention that we should pay attention to the disadvantaged, the widows and the orphans. So in his epilogue, he does mention the widow. So on page 135, the kind of narrative ending to the Code of Hammurabi, in order that the mighty not wrong the weak, to provide just ways for the waif and the widow, for the orphan and the widow. So there's this kind of interesting rhetoric about protecting weak and vulnerable people. But you won't find a single law that says anything about that in the law code. Widows are not protected in Hammurabi's law code. Orphans are not protected in Hammurabi's law code. In fact, Hammurabi's laws enforce a very rigid hierarchical society. You can see this actually happening in the law codes themselves. So if you, there's all these class-based laws in Hammurabi's code. So if you look at page 128, paragraph, it's like the little thing that looks like an S, paragraph 176a, if either a slave of the palace or a slave of the commoner marries a woman of the Awilu class. So Awilu means kind of like commoner, but it really means kind of like a free person. But this is an elevated status. So this is kind of like an upper class person. But you could see that there's other classes named, like on page 129, paragraph 178, if there's an Ugbabtu, a Naditu, or a Sekretu, whose father awards her a dowry. So these are high-ranked people who have high-ranked positions. So again, this is about enforcing order. And you'll see there's actually different law codes that respond to these people. Like within the Code of Hammurabi, there's different rules for different classes. Guess what? Rich, important people's lives are worth more, according to the law of Hammurabi, and poor people's lives are not worth as much. So if you look at law number 196, if an Awilu shall blind the eye of another Awilu, they shall blind his eye. You've heard eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Yeah, that's an ancient code, but notice who it is. It's this Awilu, the kind of upper class free person. So upper class free person, if an upper class free person takes an eye from an upper class free person, they shall take his eye. This is the upper class law. What it's trying to do is keep you from going overboard and killing someone because they took your eye. When I say overboard, I mean kind of like outsized retribution, right? The retribution shouldn't be more than the offense. So that's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's upper class law. That's aristocrat law. That's what they get. That's the privilege that they get for being upper class, is that you can't, so it's meant to limit people's retribution. Do you see that? We think of law, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth as being this horrific thing, right? That was actually that was trying to keep a lid on retribution in the ancient world. So what's next in 197? If he should break the bone of another Awilu, they shall break his bone. Okay, another eye for eye, tooth for tooth. If he shall blind the eye of a commoner, or break the bone of a commoner, he shall weigh and deliver 60 shekels of silver. So a poor person's body, you got to give him a little bit of money, but you couldn't hurt the upper class person to get recompense for a lower class person's body, because lower class person's body doesn't matter as much. If he shall blind the eye of an Awilu slave, he shall weigh and deliver 1/2 of that value in silver. So slaves are worth even less. So we see this idea that enslaved persons are taken as a matter of fact. They're going to be enslaved persons in the ancient world. This is not defended here. It's not. It's just presumed. It's a fact. And then it's also presumed that their life is just worth less. So you have upper class people, you have peasants, commoners, right? And then you have enslaved persons, and their lives they literally have different laws that apply to them. So you can see this hierarchy, right? This is baked into the law codes. One group of people you will never see referred to in any ancient law code, except for the law codes in the Bible, are aliens, wandering people who had no rights of any kind in any ancient community that we know of. outside of Israel. I'll get to those folks later, but just to say they're completely absent here. Another thing we can say, based on what we've already said, is that these laws seem harsh. If you read through these ancient law codes from a modern perspective, even if we look at our modern law codes and think that they are harsh, and indeed I think they are, and poorly constructed, these come across very harsh. So it's the harshness that we see in the Bible. It's a part of the ancient culture from which ancient Israel emerges. We know that some of Hammurabi's laws end up in the Bible, right? The ox goring law in Exodus is literally taken from Hammurabi. We'll get back to that later, though, too. But the point here of all of these laws seems to be to keep order in society. So again, really important principle of this is that criminal and civil law. So the kind of, you read through Hammurabi's code, you're going to see lots of stuff like, if this happens, then that happens. Remember, Professor Yoder taught us that's casuistic law, case law. This is criminal law. The civil law means when like two people sue each other in civil court. It's a bit different in modern law than criminal law. But all to say, anything that was about keeping order in society, that's what the king is supposed to be doing with the king's legal responsibilities. But remember, that's separate from family instruction, being nice to your parents, being a good person. What does it mean to love someone? How do you take care of nature and so on? All that stuff that's not in criminal law. That's family law. That would be or family instruction, right? The teaching that the family makes and has. And then also religious regulations would be the responsibility really of the temple. There'd be some religious stuff that would be happening in the family for local gods that you would be venerating and worshiping as a family if you were in the ancient world. But for the big temples, for the big gods, priests were in charge of all that stuff. And it wasn't necessarily ethical. Like the gods weren't necessarily interested in if you were a good person or not. Marduk doesn't really care how you treat your mom. Marduk wants Babylon to be great. That's the point. So, all to say, Israelite law that we can see in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy in particular. Numbers has some legal materials. Leviticus, we would say, is really like priestly instruction. It's a bit different. There's some legal material in Leviticus, but the big law codes, I mean, I'd say the end of Leviticus is kind of the priestly law code, the holiness code stuff. But all to say that the legal materials that we see in the Bible are very different. They're, in fact, strikingly different than ancient Near Eastern literature, at the same time that they clearly come out of it and are a part of that ancient Near Eastern culture and tradition. So again, many similarities, many differences. We see that there's a narrative, like the prologue and epilogue to Hammurabi's code. There is a prologue and epilogue to the Israelite law. That is Genesis, right? And the first 15 chapters of Exodus, or first 19 chapters really of Exodus, are all like prologue, right? That's the story of how this stuff came to be. And we see that it's a different kind of prologue than we see in Hammurabi. The gods didn't give a king of Israel the right and the responsibilities to make the law, of which the gods were kind of absent, right? The point isn't to try to make sure that order is kept in society. That's not the utmost care of the law, I would say, for ancient Israel. But then there's a little epilogue, right, too. That would be kind of the rest of the Bible. But all to say, this law code that ancient Israel has is tied up with all kinds of other interesting information and genres of literature. Remember the narrative part is actually important. It is actually part of an ancient Near Eastern tradition, although it's hugely expanded. I mean, anyone looking at ancient Israel's law code, the Pentateuch, the Torah, and thinking, I'm going to be reading a law code right now, they would have been really confused. They would want it to be like a page or something, the prologue, instead of having it be hundreds of pages. People in the ancient world thought that ancient Israel was crazy because they wrote so much. This was like a mania that they had or something. So, in any event, the biggest and strangest thing, though, I think about Israelite law is where it occurs. Not in the narrative, but it occurs in the middle of a covenant. Covenant is the most unique thing about Israelite law. Now, I should say that covenants themselves aren't unique in the ancient world. If you're in Hebrew class, berit is what we say for covenant in Hebrew, right? A covenant, or berit, is not a theological word in the ancient world, except outside of Israel. In Israel, it's a theological word. That means it has to do with God. But in Babylon, in Canaan, covenants are not religious things. They're contracts. The word covenant is the word that you would say for contract. This is like When people signed a contract to work somewhere, they'd sign a covenant. When people bought a house, they would sign a covenant. When they entered a business deal with someone else, they would sign a covenant. No ancient person that we know of, no ancient group of people enters into a covenant with their God other than Israel. The important thing here is that covenants were not theological documents. Sometimes you'd reference the gods in them. The gods were kind of backing you up or something. But you didn't make covenants with gods because that would be demeaning to the God. Gods didn't make deals with people. Gods were gods and people are mortals, right? Why would a God enter into a contract with a person? So, as you know from Professor Yoder, covenants in the ancient world themselves are usually treaties, right? We talked about the suzerainty treaty. We'll talk about that. Come back to that in a moment. But the idea that these are treaties that you're making with a god is strange. It's presumptuous. But also, we have no record of a god speaking to a people in the ancient world outside of the Bible. When I say a people, I mean a people assembled together. Gods speak to high priests in the ancient world. Gods speak to kings. Gods speak to leaders. Gods don't speak to common people, and gods especially don't speak to groups of common people and call them you, except in the Bible. The one time we have a record of a God speaking, directly addressing a group of people with no king, no high priest as an intercessor, is in Exodus. In Exodus chapter 20, God speaks to all the people, and all the people are assembled there. Remember, the people get scared, but that's later. At first, the people hear the 10 Commandments at Sinai, and God says, you are going to do this, and you are going to do that. God is addressing a people, a common group of people. In fact, the people who were enslaved and have been recently freed from that bondage. God is addressing them and saying, you. Now, just think of the radical political impact of this. People, a people in the ancient world weren't thought of as a group with any sort of power to themselves. It was the king that had power, and the king got to rule over subjects. But now, these people who were subjects of a king have become political subjects of their own. They are the ones being addressed as a subject. You. God makes a deal with these people, an arrangement. In the ancient world, people made marriage contracts. Even today, a Jewish wedding, a big part of the Jewish wedding is to sign the ketubah, the wedding contract. It's a covenant. So that's just how marriage was understood in the ancient world. It was understood contractually. So when God makes a covenant with this people, it's like God is making a marriage with these people, which explains why the marriage metaphor is so important for the prophets. Why Hosea says, hey, it's like a marriage with someone. Now, this marriage metaphor has its problems, but just think about the radical political impact of imagining that you, a group of common people, had a direct access to God, and that God had made a deal with you. God promised you things, you collectively as a group. This is earth-shattering stuff, and it also explains why ancient Israelite kings tended to downplay this covenant of Moses and tended to overstep it. I should say the covenant with Moses is also based on grace, right? That God has in some way freed and saved the Israelite people for no reason of their own, right? They didn't deserve this and they didn't earn it. Sometimes Christians think that Jews earn their salvation. That's not what Jews say. Jews say, no, we were chosen. And God doesn't really have a reason why we're chosen. I love in Deuteronomy chapter 7, I chose you because I loved you. They know that it's free grace that they have been chosen and liberated and then given this law. The law, the Torah, the instruction that God gives, and the covenant that God gives is not a burden. It's in fact a blessing, a grace on top of the grace of being freed. So all to say that this covenant that God makes that then has laws inside it is radical and would have blown the minds of ancient people. On top of that this covenant has within it laws that regulate family instruction. You shall honor your father and mother. That's in the law code it's wrapped in this covenantal arrangement, right? So this is part of the stipulations for the contract, right? That God says, if you want to be my people, and you're going to be a priestly people, like Exodus 19 says, you're going to bring blessing to all the nations of the earth, like Genesis 12 says. If you want to be a part of this, then here's what we have to do. You have to honor your father and mother. You have to honor people, right? So this idea that you're going to honor people, that would have been kind of that family instruction, but that's found in this law code that a God just gave to a people. It wasn't a king that gave this. So on top of that, you've got this civil and criminal law, right? The ox goring law is in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. And then you also have this religious and ritual instruction that's a part of this thing. It's all wrapped up together in this giant covenant that includes all these different forms of law. The impact here, I think, is that God, like the statement that's being made by all this, is that God is interested in your whole life, in everything. Everything gets mixed up. All parts of the ancient world get mixed up in this law code, and God is interested in all of it. You can't section off parts of your life from God in other ways. And that if these people, this covenantal group of people, if they are going to be mediators of God's blessing to all the nations of the world, well, then God's going to have to be in all parts of their life. Be holy as your God is holy, says Leviticus. So all to say, this, none of these laws come from a king. All of them come from God, and the people respond to them, right? The people say, yes, we will do these things, right? They have free will. The people have the ability to say yes or no. They have the ability to reject this, so that when they're called on their covenant later, it's because they said yes, they agreed to it, right? They go through this ritual of saying, yes, we will do this. So also to note in these, like everything being mixed up, right? All the people are mixed up and in fact leveled. We do have two classes, we can say, in ancient Israel, and that's enslaved persons who are treated in the law codes, and then everyone else. To say, we'll talk more about enslaved persons later on. Just to say up front, this is ethically horrific, right? Why does God have this in the law code? We know this is bad, unredeemably bad. We can't just say ancient people did this. Yeah, ancient people knew that they shouldn't be enslaved. These people had just been freed from slavery, and they knew how bad it was. Why in the world would God's law have slavery within it? Remember, I talked a little bit about the dynamic aspect of law. We'll get back to this topic in a little bit. But what's also radical about this is the idea that people can move between the category of enslaved persons and everyone else. That this is a mobile category, but that's itself pretty amazing. But also there's no upper class people who have upper class laws, and then peasants who have peasant laws, and then these different kind of subclasses that have different classes, or their lives are valued in different ways. We can say that there are some differences between men and women in these law codes, that there is a gender difference. We'll talk about gender imbalances as well, and how Deuteronomy seems to shift some of these too. But at the time, in this ancient culture, which is apart, Deuteronomy and Exodus are imagining less classes than existed in any other ancient category, in different ancient culture around them, and imagine that God was interested in all aspects of all people's lives. These are some radical things that have been claimed, and the whole community gets together and assents to this, agrees to this, and is addressed by God as you. The whole community is there. That is to say, people aren't left out. God is speaking to everyone. Okay, so I know I've gone on about that a lot, but I can't explain enough how radical and how what an impact this would have had. This might be part of the reason why nearby people had some disdain for Yahweh. Every ancient god from ancient Canaan you can find in somebody else's pantheon. Like Baal, the storm god of the Canaanites, became Seth, the storm god of ancient Egypt. So Seth literally is from Baal. Like, we have the historical receipts for this. We have the evidence for this. So different gods would be taken over as different parts of the pantheon. The only god we can't find in anyone else's pantheon is Yahweh, because Yahweh was upending systems. Yahweh was challenging basic ideas about ancient Near Eastern life and culture, and was a pariah because of it. So, in any event, all to say, remember we talked about parity covenants. We talked about different kinds of covenants that existed in the ancient world. Covenants between people who were of similar rank. So like a king of one country and a king of another country that would come to this alliance. This is the world's first peace treaty that we know of, the Treaty of Kadesh. Right now it's in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum in Turkey. But it records peace between Egypt and Turkey, the Hittite Empire, which used to inhabit central Anatolia or Asia Minor or Turkey, whatever you want to call that body of land. But in any event, this is an amazing artifact. But it was also, because it was a peace treaty, it was imaged as being between two peers, right? So they called each other brothers. We also know about the suzerainty treaties. Oh, by the way, they would hang these things. This is another Hittite a parity treaty or peace treaty. And you can see these two chains. They would hang this in a public space in a temple or in a palace. So it could be read, and it should be read every so often, right? So that people could remember what their obligations were and who their friends and who their allies were, right? But we also have this other way of thinking about covenants, and that's the suzerainty covenant, or right, as Professor Yoder taught us about, the kind of uneven covenant, right? And here you see Jehu, this guy who's bowing down right here. This is a picture of Jehu, a king of the northern kingdom of Israel, who was the first of his dynasty. He killed the last of the Omrides of Omri's dynasty in the northern kingdom of Samaria. And Jehu, who lived in the early 700s BC, here he is bowing down and kissing the ground of Shalmaneser. So this is on what's called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. It's this beautiful stone that's been carved with these images of different kings that have bowed down to him. And this is Jehu. It's actually written out here, Jehu, from the house of Omri, even though he killed the house of Omri. In any event, the Assyrians didn't really care that much about the internal politics of ancient Israel. But here we can see this. What the suzerainty covenant meant that there was a lesser king and a higher king. So Jehu here, the king of Israel, is the lower king. This is the earliest picture of an Israelite, by the way, that we know of, on Shalmaneser's Black Obelisk. And here's Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king, who's standing up, right? And here's the gods, these discs, flying discs, are the gods of Assyria, who are represented here over King Jehu. So all to say that the suzerainty covenant, this is closer to the form that we find in the Bible. That is to say that God isn't a peer of people, right? God is the suzerain, and so then there are these obligations that the people have. So the laws are not cast as like a king's command to a people. Instead, the laws are the obligations that God has made on humans, being vassals or something like this, right? So we're actually imaged as like lesser kings. All of humanity, all the community, right? Everyone is in some way kind of this like lesser royalty. But God has imposed some of these obligations on us. What we can ask, what are some of these things, right? What are some of these laws? And we can take a look at Deuteronomy and try to follow along a bit. So that's what we're going to do next, is take a look at Deuteronomy itself. By the way, this is Mersili. This is the treaty that is actually in Chris Hayes's Hidden Riches on page 161. The treaty between Mersili II of Hatti, that is the Hittite Empire, and Manapa Tarhunta of the land of the Siha River. So here is that actual artifact that you read. And you can see that there's all sorts of stuff in this vassal treaty. The vassal treaty of Esarhaddon is a much later vassal treaty. It's not a suzerainty treaty exactly, but it is a treaty for vassals, which is pretty brutal. I don't know if you read that, but there is some kind of grotesque stuff in here, curses and so on. So pages 174 and 175 that come before the vow of allegiance, and then the ceremonial curses on page 176 and 177, 178. These are meant to strike fear into you. So there's a little bit of that in Deuteronomy near the end as well. But okay, so I'm gonna stop this video now, and we'll come back and talk about some of the internals of the book of Deuteronomy. See you then.